Are you starting your Azure Purview journey and already have a metadata repository on-prem or in another system? Do you want to take that metadata repository and push it into Azure Purview in some way without having to write a lot of code? Using PyApacheAtlas and Microsoft Excel, we can take existing metadata repositories and push them into Azure Purview rapidly with very little code. In this session, we're going to cover a wide array of things that we can do inside of Excel and using the PyApacheAtlas package. First, we're going to go and actually create an Excel template. And then inside that Excel template, we are going to create some basic entities and adding on some of the default attributes. Next, we're going to examine how we can make connections between different data sets and different assets. And then we're also going to add on even more advanced features like adding terms and classifications, even experts and owners. And then for the Apache Atlas group, we'll also cover talking about labels, not security labels for Purview, but labels inside of Apache Atlas, as well as custom attributes as well. If you want to find out more and see more detailed documentation around this, please check out the links in here on Data Smackdown and on GitHub for the PyApacheAtlas package. First, we need to create the template. So after having installed PyApacheAtlas, and please see the video if you haven't done that already, you can just run this command on the terminal. So let's go do that in VS Code. Here I am in VS Code, and I'm going to run that command we saw on the slide. And that command is python-m PyApacheAtlas --make-template. And then I have to provide the file path where I want to actually store this template. So I'm just going to store this in /demo.xlsx. And that has created an Excel file that we can examine. In this template, we have a bunch of different tabs. The main one we will be focused on is the bulk entities tab. However, in other videos and more documentation online, there's updating level of lineage as well as column level mapping. You can also perform type definitions in here as well as classification definitions. But again, we're going to focus on creating our first asset here on the bulk entities tab. Now that we have the template created, how do we actually create our first entity? We're going to start with something very basic, and then we'll work our way to something more complex. In Excel, we have 3 required columns. The first one is the type name. And so this is Apache Atlas or Azure Purview specific, or your custom types as well. So I'm going to assume you have some knowledge of the type system, but at a basic level, we have types for things like Azure SQL tables, Hive tables, Hive columns, Azure SQL columns, etc. So you do need to be aware of the type system when you are working with Azure Purview or Apache Atlas. For the first part, I'm going to just create a basic data set. And this is available by default in both Apache Atlas as well as Azure Purview. So that's the start. So I'm going to create a data set. And effectively, it's like a table. There's also a column type if I wanted to work with some basic columns. But right now, let's just stick with a data set. Then I provided a friendly name, essentially. So this is the name that I'm going to see in the UI, and it's going to be very, very clear, as a friendly name. So let's just call this my first data set, let's say. The next thing we need to provide is a qualified name, and that qualified name is a unique key, essentially. It's not the GUID, it is just a unique string value that is unique across your Purview instance. So there's often conventions tied to this as well. Like, for example, if you're going to work with an Azure SQL table, it'll often be, or it always is, MS SQL : //, then it's the server name, then it's the database name, then it's the schema name, then it's the table name. In this case, since it's a data set, there's no real convention, so I'm just going to call this my first data set. And yep, I know I'm using first and the number 1 in here, it'll be fine. So I could first save this, and I can create a data set with this. So let's just do that. I'm going to save, and then I will go back to VS Code and we'll run the sample script that I had available to us. Here in VS Code, I have a script that I've created in advance, and it's also available on GitHub. But essentially, I'm doing a couple imports, importing the standard library JSON to manipulate the JSON data that we will get back. I am importing the Azure CLI credential. Again, this is very useful because I have the Azure CLI installed and I've already logged in and authenticated with my identity. Then the PyApacheAtlas specific thing here is the Purview client. Since I'm using this example with Azure Purview, I need to be able to communicate with the Purview client. So I initialize, I set up saying, hey, use my Azure CLI credential. We'll skip past this comment for right now. And then next, I also import an Excel configuration class and an Excel reader class. The Excel configuration allows me to do a lot of customization to the Excel template, like renaming tabs, like renaming columns, giving different ways of delimiting multi-valued cells, but we're not going to get into that. There'll be another video or documentation online for that as well. However, by default, the template will work with the default Excel configuration. Next, we have to provide an Excel reader. And so the Excel reader takes in the Excel configuration object. So great, we have a reader that has some configuration attached to it. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to parse our bulk entities tab. And so that is with the reader object, in which we have the parse bulk entities method, and then we provide just the file path to it. And so then we'll get the results of it, and we will get the results of the parsing stored into the entities variable, and then we will do an upload through our Purview client, the client.upload entities. And so great, then it'll push out the results to us, and we will hopefully see something in the Purview portal. So what I'll do is I will just run this command. And when it completes, we will see a set of hopefully mutated entities that indicates that there was a creation happening. And then at the very bottom, it'll also give us the GUID assignments. So technically, we could go into the Purview portal and plug this into the URL and get there directly. However, we're going to just browse to it. So here in the Purview portal, I'm going to click on Browse Assets. And since I chose a data set, I'm going to check out here in my source type. It is part of the Atlas core set of types. So I'll click into it, and we should be able to see my first data set. And so great, my friendly name is there, my qualified name is there, but that was all I provided. So I didn't provide a description, I didn't provide classifications. It's very, very bare bones here. So what can we do next? Let's at least give it a description. Back in Excel, I can add on additional columns as part of my basic adding attributes to this. I can add on additional columns for my type. So a data set has a description type or description attribute. So I can provide a description and say, this is my first data set's description. I can save this and go back to VS Code and rerun this. Now that I've reran this, you'll see that it's no longer a create, it's an update statement instead. And I can see that that GUID assignment is still the same. So great, I'm just gonna go back to Purview and I'm gonna refresh the page. And you can see now that I do have an actual description. So as an example, this is our data set. We can go and use that tab to both create entities and update them as well. So it's also important to note that there are certain properties that are available on a particular entity, right? So for example, in theory, I can update any of these basic properties just through the Excel tab, the Excel bulk entities tab, and the little bit of PyApacheAtlas code we had to write there. Let's move on to a more complex example. Here's a more complex example. I'm going to create a Hive table, and this is a type that's available both in Azure Purview as well as Apache Atlas. And I'm going to give it a silly friendly name, a silly qualified name, and then I'm going to use the standard description, as well as it has a property called comment and a property called retention, and that is an integer type. So how did I know what were these attributes? Well, going back to our demo script, I have a little bit of snippet of code that is commented out that I use in advance to download all the types. This snippet of code calls out a method called getAllTypeDefs on the Purview client. And then it takes that value and then it writes it out to a JSON file that I've just called types.json. And in types.json, it has an entry for every single type. And in this case, I just did a control F for name, name in quotes, colon, space, hive underscore table. I found that to be a pretty effective method to whittle it down to just the definition, the entity definition of a Hive table. It doesn't always work. So there are some types that are mentioned very, very often, but this is a nice little shortcut. So great, I've got the Hive table definition, and I'll scroll through here and I'll look at first these attribute definitions. And this tells me, oh, great, It has an attribute called create time. And another important part is this is optional. This says is optional true, meaning I don't need to specify it. I can, but I don't have to. Now I'll keep scrolling. Last access time, comment. Okay, cool. It's a string type. Neat. Is optional true. A retention type. Okay, it's an integer. Okay, it's optional true. Aliases. This is where there's a little bit of complexity. At the time of this recording, PyApacheAtlas does not support the array string operation here for attributes. That'll come in a later feature, but currently it does not. And so same thing for complex objects like a map. This is not supported in here. If you want to do this, you can do it through code. And you can, again, you'll take the results of the parsing and you can modify it, of course, but it doesn't come out of the box right now in PyApacheAtlas. More to come on that hopefully soon. And so great, this is what I would do. If I had a custom type or if I had a type that I was wanting to working with, I would search for it in my types list and then I would go and execute the code. So great, I'm just going to save this really quickly and I am going to go ahead and rerun our demo.py to ensure that we get this new asset. Great, we have another create result and we can see that it's a Hive table. It's based on my qualified name. That looks like the right one. Awesome, I'm going to go back to Purview and I'm going to go check this out. I'm back into Purview and I'm going to first go for browsing assets. Then I'm going to go by source type and I will refresh. And now it doesn't always show up. So I'm going to go ahead and do a search instead. And so you can see it shows up in search. The browse assets screen, I believe it updates on a background job, so it won't be an immediate update as we saw in that alert. So great, I'm going to go into my Hive table I made, and then I'll look at properties. You can see already that I have the asset description there, properties, and great. So I have these all filled in. Retention succeeded, and then qualified name was there, descriptions there, comments there. This is excellent. You see that temporary, I did not specify temporary, and if we go back to the type definitions, we'll probably see that this has a default value and that it's defaulting to false. And that's creating simple entities and attributes. When you're creating one or independent entities, you can create many, many different entities here, right? I could have listed out 100 different entities inside of that Excel spreadsheet, and I could have, uploaded them all at the exact same time. So that's the power of that basic data entry of the Excel spreadsheet and PyApacheAtlas. We can make lots and lots of entities very, very rapidly as long as we know what the types are, what the columns name, the column attributes are going to be, as well as you can have some means of defining that qualified name and that friendly name in there. We talked about the headers, right? And each header that we added was essentially an attribute. So by default, if you add any other column outside of type name, qualified name, and name, those are by default assumed to be attributes. There are a handful that have special meaning. We're going to explore all of these. The first starting off with the relationship header. So if you have a column header that says in brackets, relationship, close bracket, space, something, that is going to be considered a relationship attribute. And it's essentially a pointer to either an asset that we are working with in the spreadsheet or an existing asset as well. Then there's the brackets root classifications, and this is for specifying the classifications that you want to work with or that you want to assign to this given entity you're uploading. Then there are a handful that are only supported for Azure Purview, and that is experts and owners. So if you have the experts or the owners column header, it has a special meaning inside of Purview and has special functionality in PyApacheAtlas as well. And then finally, we have some Apache Atlas only column headings. For right now, there will be changes, of course, in Azure Purview to hopefully support some of these things. But for right now, there's root labels, and that is for the label feature inside of Apache Atlas, not security labels in Azure Purview. And then finally, we have the custom attributes, and that's specified with bracket, custom, close bracket, and then the name of that attribute you want to apply. Business metadata will come eventually. If that hasn't shown up already, I'd love to see it on any issues on GitHub to see if you have any thoughts around how you might want to see that inside of Excel, because it is a complex type of a dictionary. So we'd love to have your feedback there as well. So let's dive into relationships. We're going to explore two ways of doing this, right? So first one is that we are going to do an upload of let's say Hive table with Hive columns at the same time, and we will relate the two. Next, we're also going to connect, let's say, a new column to an existing entity. And we will do that upload without having to touch the existing entity. So let's jump into Excel and see what this will look like. In this case, I'm going to create a single Hive table with two columns, columns A and column B. So this is what that spreadsheet might look like and how you might create your own, let's say, Azure SQL tables or any other MySQL tables, whatever other DB2s, etc. that you might want to create. So first, we're going to define in order the Hive table, right? For creating relationships when you do the uploads at the same time, the parent has to come first. So for example, let's say you had to define a server, a database, and then a table. You would have to define the server in row 2, the database in row 3, the table in row 4. In this case, we have the table first in row 2, then the columns that are related to the table in rows 3 and 4. So we specify the same required fields, right? The type name, the name, and the qualified name. You'll notice that in rows 3 and 4 for the Hive columns, I have specified the qualified name as table number 2, pound symbol or hashtag, whatever you want to call it, column A, and then table number 2, pound symbol, column B. And this is a convention. This is something that you'll see often inside of Azure Purview types as well as ApacheAtlas types. This is the way that they tend to reference, you have your parent asset, its qualified name, and then the pound symbol, and then the child's friendly name to signify how they are related. And it's also very helpful because it's unique, guaranteed, hopefully unique. So then we have this special column right here, the relationship table column. And how do I know that I need to add this? Well, I would go back to my list of type definitions, and then I would see that, how does a column relate to a specific table? Inside of the relationship attributes field, which I'll go to right now, I have a concept called a table. So I'm sitting here inside of the Hive column entity definition, and I see that they have a relationship called table, and it is tied to a Hive table. So this pointer only accepts points to a Hive table. It says is optional false, meaning it's a required field. If I'm going to create a Hive column, I must specify a table through this relationship attribute. In addition, it tells me that this is a single, right? So I can only specify one table that this column is related to, which makes total sense. So these are the 4 things that you need to be aware of when dealing with relationships: is the name of that relationship on a particular type, and then you need to know what does it accept. Is it a required one or is it optional? And then is it allowing for multiple or single pointers to this specific type? So again, I have a relationship attribute called table. And for this case, since I have defined this in the exact same spreadsheet, I am going to be able to just reference the qualified name. Again, since qualified name is supposed to be unique, I can just reference the qualified name here, and this will work just fine. And the important part again is that this qualified name in cell D3 appears prior to row 3. And so I cannot do something like this and have it specified after, because by the application, it just doesn't know where to find it. It processes things sequentially. So great, this will allow us to make a connection. And when we do the upload, I'll be able to say, connect this Hive table with these Hive columns. I will satisfy the required relationship attribute through this method here. And then finally, I had to add in another column of a regular attribute, not a relationship attribute, a regular attribute of type. And this is only specified on the Hive column because it's a required field. So I'm going to create these as strings and integers, and that's fine. I will save this and we'll just rerun demo.py. And so great, we ran demo.py again, and we have a new create statement where we are listing out all the attributes we created, or all the entities we created, a table and 2 columns. And again, we have the GUID assignments that we can go look up as well. So let's go back to Purview and let's see what happened here. I did a quick search for table number 2, and I'm going to go into the schema, and I can see right here column A and column B. Excellent. And so if I clicked into column A, I will see that I have a property, and excellent, it's going to be the right type that I specified. It's a string, and I can go back to table or column B and see that it is an integer. So great, that is how we would upload at the exact same time. If I'm creating just a mass representation of tables and columns, Azure SQL tables, Azure SQL columns, MySQL tables, MySQL columns, or what have you, anything that has a relationship, we can do it all at the same time. And we need only to specify the parent in the previous rows, as well as, and then reference that parent in that relationship attribute. And again, we would need to know the relationship attribute by looking at the type definition and seeing how does it connect to that particular type. Coming back to our second method of doing this is, what if I don't want to specify that Hive table? What if I want to create additional columns and I just need to reference it, right? And I want to just make that association, but I don't want to re-upload the existing table. So we can use a special value called the AtlasObjectId. Let's go see how that works. Back in Excel, I'm going to just reference two new columns. I'm going to append two columns to our existing table number 2 because I don't want to create table number 2 again. I don't want to risk changing anything about table number 2. So I just want to add these columns to it. How do I accomplish this? Well, first, again, specify the required fields. And again, follow that convention. Table number 2, pound symbol, column C, column D, so that we have a consistent way of doing this. Next, we have that same relationship table, but in this case, we are going to use a special value that PyApacheAtlas understands, and it's called the AtlasObjectId. And there's two ways of doing this. So I'm going to zoom in, and we can see that we have the type name and qualified name specified inside some parentheses and prefixed with AtlasObjectId. This is a special syntax that we need to be able to know all the values for. So if you know that it's a Hive table and its qualified name is table number 2, we can just plug that in and we don't have to worry about actually doing an upload or re-uploading table number 2 or our existing Hive table. Another way of doing this, if you actually have the GUID from the Purview or Apache Atlas UI, which is accessible via the browser, here in the browser, I can see the Purview GUID right here. And so I can copy this and bring this back over to Excel. And in this case, the AtlasObjectId would be, again, the prefix, parentheses, GUID, colon, that GUID right there. And that's it. So now I don't have to, again, make any additional changes. And this is really beneficial for things like an Azure SQL table, which actually requires you to upload with it the DB schema. So if I don't want to have this chain of dependencies that I have somehow inadvertently created, that modifying one entity requires changing or referencing multiple parents, then this is a very convenient way of doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we will rerun, and we will see in Purview that we have column C and D attached to our table. And there we go. Again, we have created two columns, in this case, C and D. Let's go back to Purview and see that they are there. So I'm back on table number 2, and I will quickly refresh. And now we have columns A, B, C, and D with the appropriate data types as well. So that is how we would end up working with existing entities and being able to reference them with the AtlasObjectId construct, right? Either specifying the type name and the qualified name, or specifying just the GUID. And please check the documentation for the specific semantics here. It's particular, it's a regular expression that it employs, so spacing does matter, right? So just be aware of that. But I think it'll be very useful for you as you work with existing entities and trying to update them with those relationship attributes. Great. So now we're on to the advanced side of the place. So let's take a look at some key components here. Let's first just get some ground rules and kind of an understanding of what the setup requires. So let's go into Purview. First, I wanted to share the Purview glossary. So we're going to work with terms. And the important part within both the programmatically and the REST API, as well as in PyApacheAtlas, for terms, you must use the formal name. So if I click into parent term here, we will see that the formal name is the word parent term. Great. Very easy, very straightforward. Let's go back and check out the child of this. In fact, actually, we can go to related, and we can go to children, and here's the child term. Notice how the child term is parent term underscore child term. That semantic right there is required within PyApacheAtlas, as well as just in general, the REST API. It must reference this formal name. So let's take a look at how we might adjust our Excel sheet to incorporate these glossary terms. In Excel, we're going to define two new tables. We're going to take table number 3, table number 4. And in this case, again, we specify the required fields, type name, qualified name. And now we're going to add on a relationship meanings attribute. So inside of ApacheAtlas and Azure Purview, the glossary term assignment when doing a bulk upload is a relationship attribute, and it is tied to this meanings column, this meanings relationship attribute. So again, this is a special header, right? So it'll just plug this into the meanings relationship attribute, and there's a little bit of additional processing inside of PyApacheAtlas to formulate this in the correct way. So again, you don't have to worry about it, but you can always inspect the output of parse bulk entities to see what it's doing. So in any case, I have specified in these tables, I'm going to upload both the parent term and the child term for table number 3. Notice how I have parent term, semicolon, parent term underscore child term. Again, parent term is a formal name for the parent term, and parent term underscore child term is the formal name for the child term. And the semicolon is the default delimiter within relationship attributes. So relationship attributes has the ability to split these individual cells up into multiple attributes. Again, we saw that some relationship attributes, instead of being a single, they could be a set. And so it could take on multiple values. And so this is an example of one. So we'll see that we can assign these multiple terms to this one relationship attribute. And then just for completeness, I'm also going to upload just the child term itself to table number 4. And again, I have to specify the formal name, which is why you see parent term underscore child term. So I'm going to save this, and we'll go back to Python and check it out. Great, it is upload both table 3 and 4. It's a create, so we created something new. Let's go to Purview and check it out. So I'm looking at table number 3 first, and you can see down here, glossary terms, I have 2 of them attached. Excellent, so this worked out perfectly. It has both the parent term and the child term. Let's look at table number 4. Table number 4, we can see if we have 1 glossary term in this case. It's just the child term. So this was a success. We can demonstrate how we can add glossary terms at the time of upload. I will note though that when doing an update, this no longer works. By design in ApacheAtlas, only the updates to glossary terms work when it is through a different endpoint. So you'll have to programmatically, using the Purview client, there is a section on glossary terms or on glossary methods that you can explore to do updates to these things. But if I were to rerun this with different terms, it won't necessarily update these. If I'm doing a create, I can assign them at this time. Next, how do we do classifications? Before we dive into in Excel, I want to first show how we're going to get the classification information. So in Azure Purview, it specifies a formal name for the classification. This is similar in ApacheAtlas, but it's much more apparent, I think. Inside of Azure Purview, we need to go to the data map and into classifications, and then we can look at the formal name of any of these given built-in classifications. If you have custom classifications, those too will have formal names. So if I wanted to assign that this particular asset contained a personal age, right? And I'm going to use the Microsoft built-in classifications. Again, I'm assigning the classification. I'm not actually scanning the data in any way. I am manually assigning this. I would take this Microsoft.personalAge and I would copy it, or of course, programmatically enter this into my Excel spreadsheet, and then and any others as well. I can grab as many of these classifications that I want to and use my semicolon delimitation, and great, I can plug this into Excel, which is what we're going to do next. But the important part here is you need to go to the data map the classifications, and the formal name. So next, what I've done is I'm going to create table number 5, my next Hive table, and I'm going to create 2 classifications here. I'm going to take personal age, as well as I saw personal email in there too. So the column header is root in brackets space classifications. That is because it's at the root level. That is going to control a root attribute here and update that root attribute. So in addition, the PyApacheAtlas has a little bit of code that will massage these string values into the right format for Apache Atlas and Azure Purview. So great, I'm going to save this and we'll run demo.py and check out table number 5. Great, we have a create, it's table number 5. Let's go check this out in Purview. So I did a quick search for table number 5, and here are our 2 classifications here. And so you can see they display the friendly name, but of course we had to use the formal name to do this. And again, I was able to specify as many classifications I want using the as default semicolon delimiter and plug it into that root classification section in Excel. Next, we move on to experts and owners inside of Purview. In this case, we have a couple nuances that we need to know about the way that Purview handles experts and owners. By default, PyApacheAtlas will just pass the information that you plug in into Excel directly into Azure Purview. So experts and owners inside of Azure Purview are actually represented by the Azure Active Directory object ID. And so it's some weird GUID, right? It doesn't make any sense, no rhyme or reason to it. It's some randomly generated number and string that will represent this user. That's typically not helpful. So if you had access to it, you could do something like this, where you just plug in, expert, whatever it is, right? There's got a semicolon there, but it's fine. Maybe that's your GUID, and you would plug that in. You could, of course, do multiple experts with semicolons in here as the default, and great, I could reference that. However, again, this is not very useful, but it will work if you have the object IDs offhand and you just want to plug it in like that. A more useful feature of PyApacheAtlas is the ability to work with either universal principal names or the email address of the user, the primary email address of the user. So, for example, if you are, will@contoso.onmicrosoft.com, perhaps that is your user, your principal, username, your UPN. And so, great, I could do this. I can do, bob@contoso.onmicrosoft.com. That's going to be, again, your UPN. So how would we use this, right? And if I know the UPNs, how do we use this? In this case, since I'm using the UPN, I can modify my call to parse bulk entities, and I can specify the contacts func parameter. And it takes in a value of a function. And this function will be called on every single element that you provide to the experts or owners columns. Since we plugged in 2, this function will be called twice. This client.msgraph.upn2id method will take, uses the Purview client. Inside of there is a property called the msgraph, and it has helper functions that communicate with the msgraph and connects to a particular, uses the UPN, the principal name, to get the object ID, and that's all its function is. It's just a very simple function that calls the Microsoft Graph API, and you pass in the UPN, it provides back the object ID. So this is handy because I don't need to know the Microsoft Graph. It'll just call those API endpoints for me. A couple things with this msgraph piece though is, if you're a user using Azure CLI credentials, you most likely have the ability to actually call the msgraph. The function will take care of getting the access token and all that for you. You don't have to worry about it. But as a user, you most likely have the ability to do this. If you're using a service principal or a managed identity to actually authenticate against Purview, you may need to give that service principal or managed identity the ability to query the msgraph. That's, there'll be links in the broader documentation for this, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So you may have to do some setup work, is what I'm trying to say here. But ultimately, this is what we would end up having to do. We would be able to create this connection, and we would be able to run this function, and that msgraph UPN to ID will be called each time. Let's say you don't have the UPN. You don't know that this is your UPN email address, right? So perhaps instead you have, will@contoso.com and bob@contoso.com. Great, that can work too. But instead of using the UPN to ID, we have the email to ID function instead. And great, there it is. That's all we have to do for it, is just connect this email to ID. And I want to just call out for those who are beginning in their Python journey, this is essentially passing the function around as a first-party citizen. And a common mistake is to include the parentheses here. You do not want to do that. That is actually calling the function on a null value. It'll error out. So you want to actually pass the function as a function and not the results of the function. And that would be, the results of the function is, again, this will error, but I just want to call the fact out that you're passing the function itself into it. And in fact, if you're not using ApacheAtlas, or if you have some other means for looking up the IDs, perhaps you've got a dictionary or a hash map or something like that you want to use, well, you can write a function and you can pass it in. Whatever means you have to plug in there, right? If you wanted to do a concatenation function or something like that took the results of Excel and concatenated it with your email address or something like that, fine. You can write that function, right? You can, let's look at what that might be, right? Concat email address or something like that. And so that's going to be our function, and it's going to take in a email, or I guess perhaps a username, and we would just return, let's say, username plus @fabricam.com, let's say. And so great. What we would end up doing for my custom function, I would just plug it in like that. And so now, in this case, it would, for every single entry I made, concatenate the word @fabricam.com to the results of this. That won't help for Azure Active Directory and object IDs, but if you're using ApacheAtlas, this might be helpful. Again, if you have some sort of already existing AAD object dictionary, and you already have some sort of mappings from will@contoso, and my object ID is ABC123 perhaps, you might write a function of perhaps lookup in dictionary perhaps. And again, you take in some sort of user, and then you just reach out into the broader AtObjectId dictionary, and you look for the user, and you return that. So maybe you already have some sort of dictionary that you can look up against, and again, you just pass this in. For those of you worried about additional calls against the Graph API, if you have thousands of entries in here, there is an internal caching mechanism. It does have a dictionary on the inside, so if you have will@contoso multiple times, it'll only call will@contoso one time. And then from here on out, it'll just look up in the internal cache in memory. And so again, you aren't going to be calling it thousands of times unless you have thousands of unique email addresses or UPNs at this point. But again, the primary ones that I think you're going to be using the most often is client.msgraph.email2id if you have email addresses, or if you have the UPN to ID. Those are probably the primary ones you're going to have. And so again, that would be the extent to which we would do our uploads with the experts and owners. And again, the column headings are special. Experts and owners, when you do this, it knows very special functionality, how to organize this information inside of here. And I will note that there is no way to append an expert or an owner. It is an overwrite. So if you're about to update this, table 5, let's say, you are going to update the experts and owners for table 5 that exists already, then you are going to overwrite them with whatever you provide here in PyApacheAtlas and in the Excel file. So they're either, you bring down, you look up who the experts are, or you do this more programmatically. There's other ways, programmatically with the Purview client to get a specific entity, and then you could take the data out of that entity and massage it a little bit. That's again a little bit beyond this Excel video, but those are options. If you plan on appending expert and owner information to it, you may have to be a little more custom than the built-in Excel feature. Last but not least, the Apache Atlas side of things, there's a couple other special column headers that will allow you to do some nice features that are only available in Apache Atlas at the time of this recording. Here again, I have a Hive table. I've filled in my required fields. And in this case, I'm demonstrating both at the same time. First is labels. So again, if you're using Apache Atlas, you're already familiar with the fact that you can append labels. For those of you who are on the Purview side and still watching, this is not security labels. This is a different feature available only in Apache Atlas at the time of recording. So great, I can do semicolon delimited, again by default. You can change that with the Excel configuration, and I can, add in essentially any arbitrary label I want. Same thing for custom attributes. In this case, it's bracket custom, and then the very next word that you have is going to be the attribute name. And so this is another one of those scenarios where I can do this at creation time, but updates cannot be applied here because the attributes themselves, or I guess Apache Atlas, does not support these fields on the bulk entity update endpoint. And so there's other attributes you can use again, so you may have to get more programmatic about this, but when you're creating an entity for the first time, this can be very, very handy in just being able to specify, whatever labels you want to apply to it and whatever custom attributes you want to apply to it as well. And with that, thank you so much for viewing on how to do bulk uploading of entities with Excel and PyApacheAtlas. Hopefully at the end of this, you're able to feel comfortable in generating the template, working with the basic attributes, maybe even looking up the types yourself inside of the get all type defs method, and then using, especially for the Purview users, using the MS Graph functionality to look up experts and owners as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out on GitHub. Looking forward to your feedback and your experiences with PyApacheAtlas.